Okay, welcome to the number 11 of the mini lectures in 7503 NSE Aviation Economics. This one we're going to be touching on airline case studies, and we're going to be discussing information technology for airline distribution and airport economic impacts. Now, if you remember back to the model, we spoke in the model about the importance of airport as part of airline planning. Airports are significant economic forces in the airline industry today. But information technology is one that hides behind the scenes in a way that it is really hidden from sight in some ways, and yet if the information technology hadn't developed the way it had, airlines couldn't operate on the scale they do today. And as they find out to their cost, when things do go wrong with information technology, they pay a terrible price. So in this one, we're going to be talking about how information technology affects airline planning and operations. We're going to be talking about airline distribution systems, computer reservation systems, the terminology and capability of their systems, alternative airline distribution systems, and IT challenges of evolving distribution channels. We're going to also describe distribution costs and e-commerce developments. These are really making a difference in airlines trying to get the cost of their operations down. We'll look at the implications for airlines and consumers. You're probably aware of many of these at the moment. The fact that you can use your smartphone now as a check-in, as part of the airline ticketing process. We're going to list some of the innovations in passenger processing, and then we're going to go into details of airport ownership, management, user charges and financing. Well, first of all, in our airline planning model, we spoke about the vision, the mission, the gap that had to be closed, the goals that were used to define that gap, the strategies, the route planning, the fleet planning, the schedule development. And in schedule development, we know alone IT is an important part of schedule development in doing the what-ifs. We looked at the pricing. IT is a part of the pricing equation. Revenue management systems, as we saw, were linked in with many other systems, including the computer reservation systems and the sales and distribution. We also looked at crew scheduling, which IT plays a role, airport resource management, and the operations control. So what we're slowly doing now is completing the last of all those different activities that form part of the airline planning model. So how do we use airline technology in airlines today? Well, first of all, the one thing is that we know that IT forms a part of what we discussed in the previous lecture. For example, the databases, the historical database, the forecaster, and how that's used and how it's connected into the revenue management system. But the greatest advance has been in the schedule planning, operations control and revenue management. And we know that airlines these days generally have a operations control centre, sometimes called a systems operator control centre, or something that means pretty much the same. The other thing that we know is from discussing the use of management for airlines, that airlines use operations research to do their predictions for the future, to test concepts, and IT is an essential part of being able to crunch those large amounts of data and that decisions that are made to answer the what-ifs. So these are a very important part of airline operations. If we look at the global distribution system, that is, the systems that are used by airlines to take in the bookings of passengers and to allocate seats on their aircraft. If we look at the market share around the world, we see that there are a number of systems. There are other systems, but we'll just be studying the main ones. And we have the Sabre system, which has got about 30% of the market, Galileo, which has got 21% of the market, WorldSpan 9%, Abacus 5%, and of course Amadeus with 35%. So straight away we can see that these systems, some of them are really big, and these are simply companies that provide the tools that airlines use to do their bookings. If we look at the market share, we can see that the share in Europe shows different figures. And if we take a look at the US global distribution system market, Sabre, which shows 30% on the overall world market, is 50% there. And of course in Australia we find Sabre's only about 35%, And Galileo, which is only 21% on the world market, is really the big player here with 50%. So these global distribution systems are vital. Airlines cannot work without them. When their systems go down, as Virgin Australia found with one of their systems going down a number of years ago, it went down on the Monday, they got it up and running, and it went down again just after midweek. And they found the impact on the passengers and their operations was so great that they had to change to a more reliable system. If we look at these reservation systems, as we said, there are companies that provide these different global distribution systems which are used to take reservations. But the one thing is that the airlines have their own reservation systems called Res. And this is usually a proprietary system that contains the flight schedules, the prices, their seat inventory, real-time operational information, and so on. This contains the airline's own intellectual property. It is commercial in confidence. It's the sort of thing that they wouldn't want their competitors to get because it would show just what they're planning to do with their schedules, how their prices work and the decision models, how they allocate seats. And so generally the Res system is a really important part of any computer reservation system. Generally the Res is hosted on the airline's own mainframe IT system or hosted outside by an IT provider. But the one thing is that Res works in conjunction with either a computer reservation system or a global distribution system to basically work together to conduct the airline's operations. Here we see a diagram and it shows the airline Res system with its flight records and operational data, its inventory records, its fares and rules database, that is, how are we going to actually keep changing the fares as the bookings are made, the passenger name record database, and also the customer database as to who's flown with the airline in the past. And this is used to input into the departure check-in and the flight dispatch side. If we look at the airline planning system, we have the schedule optimizer, which we looked at in the previous lecture as part of the passenger origin destination system. We've got the crew and aircraft planning feeding into that because that's important so that people know exactly what the flights are that are going to be going out. The revenue management system, and we studied that, of course, in a previous lecture, and the pricing decision support. So the airline planning systems fit into the airline Res itself, which then inputs into either the computer reservation system or the global distribution system, those ones such as Amadeus, Galileo and Sabre that we were talking about before. And this helps then perform the schedule functions, and very often this has to be done in conjunction with other airlines. The pricing functions, that is, the decision has been made on the pricing goes in, and the sales that are made. So what we're seeing here is a very simplified system of a very, very complex operation that is at the heart of the airline operations every second of every hour of every day. The one thing that we know is that airlines also use internet distribution channels, and airlines have their own sites. The one thing that low-cost carriers found is that airlines in the past have traditionally used travel agents, but airlines said, we have to pay them a commission. Why don't we do this all ourselves? And so very often we find that many of the airlines run their own websites where people can actually log in to buy it. People can still go to a travel agent to get their tickets, but airlines try to run their own websites so that they can get a cut of the action without having to pay commissions to people. And also we get those sites such as Webjet, which allow you to go in and compare price offers. And these have web scraping tools which actually go through and find out what's being offered and help people make a decision as to where to go. Just as IT is important for an airline to operate, so is an airport essential for an airline to operate. And what we're going to discuss now is airport capacity, delays and management. First of all, the first thing about an airport is they have two sides, the air side and the land side. The air side being concerned with the aircraft operations and the land side concerned with being able to provide a place for people to arrive, check their cars, park their cars, do shopping and also be able to be processed by the airline. The one thing that we know is that within airports itself, if air transport is growing, so airports have to grow in their capacity to handle that growth. And this depends on a number of elements, such as sufficient runways, sufficient taxiways so that there's no congestion on the runways itself, and sufficient apron space to park aircraft. Also, we have the air traffic control side, which decides as to how expeditiously aircraft are fed into an airport and how expeditiously they depart. So runway capacity is very, very important. And airports need to be able to check to take into account what ifs. That is, what if we get a storm, which means that traffic has to hold off before entering the airport? How can we process them quickly? What's the best way to get the best use out of our current runways and air traffic control systems? How can we handle all these variations that are imposed by weather? How can small demand changes, such as an airline handling extra crowds going to a football game interstate, how can that be done? What's the best way to get the best utilisation out of our runway? And so here we see again the mathematics coming in to make sure that just as the airline has to optimise the use of its aircraft, so the airport is optimising the use of its facilities to handle the flow of aircraft. That here we can see some of the different airports that we have around the world. And for example, this is an example of Washington Dulles Airport. And we can see an airport here that has grown across the years. For example, back in the 1980s, we only had the small part at the top of the screen. Now the terminals have had 2 expansions since, and with that expansion and the use of the spaces in between the different concourses, they've installed an underground rail system to help speed passengers from arrival to the different concourses, as well as process passengers flying into the airport so that they can get to baggage handling. So airport layout now is far more important to make sure that they get the best utilisation of the space available, not just out of the runways, not just out of the parking aprons and gates, but also out of the concourses and the swift and expeditious flow of passengers between the terminals and departing to their destinations in Washington itself. Airport ownership itself has changed across the years. Once upon a time, governments were the major owners of airports, but now the cost of airports has grown so great, and governments are now taking this attitude of user pays. So airports are now run by private authorities, and there's been this transition from national governments to these private authorities to make sure that, first of all, the airport expands to fill growth, but that expansion is paid for by the industry itself. And also that the government still has some form of governance to make sure that the new owners of the airport or the new people operating the airport on long-term leases don't use their monopoly power to, in fact, overcharge the users of that airport. So very often, an airport is a corporate organisation. It can be owned by a government, private investors, or a combination of these, but it's operated to get the best possible use of the facilities possible. And we discussed different uses, such as Brisbane Airport and airports overseas in different countries around the world. The one thing is, airports pay people to use their facilities. And so we have a basis of different charges. We have the airport revenues that come from a variety of users. For example, on the air side, the airlines obviously pay to use the airport facilities themselves, and there's a certain charge based on that. People who arrive at the airport have to pay for parking, and also people who operate the shopping centres also pay to operate there. So the charge classifications go into aeronautical side and a non-aeronautical side. And of course what we're finding is that airports now, because they are such centres of commercial activity, that the income from the aeronautical side, which we would have expected to be the primary source of income, is almost becoming equal with the income from the non-secondary side. That is, from parking charges, from rentals charged to commercial operators. And airports are now making sure that there is no land wasted. That is, if there's land that's unusable, can that be used for office space, charged out at rental, or can it be used for shopping outlets, as we've seen at many airports? The big thing is with these airport charges is how it actually takes place. And this is causing a lot of controversy, which we study in the course. For example, what the airlines are saying is, well, we're paying to use the airports, but you're making a lot of money elsewhere from it, but you're not putting that money back into the aeronautical side. And so we'll be discussing the two concepts, the single till approach and the dual till approach. That is, the single till approach, which the airlines want, which says all money coming in from aeronautical and non-aeronautical means is used to upgrade the airport. Whereas the dual till is one where the airport says, well, we want to make a certain profit, which we don't want to plough back into other infrastructure. And so we'll see the way in which this operates around the world. We'll look at an example of an airport regulatory model, which takes a look at the fact as to how airport charges can be set. And we'll look at the market-based approach, the charges set by the airport itself, and the more formal economic regulation which comes in, which decides as to whether there will be caps put on prices, as to what a proper rate of return is that the airport should expect, and how this can operate. And this is a very important model in airport operations today because it's one that causes great controversy within the airlines themselves. When it comes to financing new airports and upgrades, it's very similar to the airlines itself. And what we'll be taking a look at is the way in which airports are financed themselves. And we'll be looking at government grants, special purpose user taxes, such as departure and arrival taxes, low-cost loans, such as those that the World Bank provides to certain countries, profit proportions from the airport operator, loans from commercial banks, general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, and project-specific revenue bonds. So all of these are important, just as we saw the different means of financing the purchase or acquisition of aircraft by airlines. So airports themselves, which are very, very expensive entities, there are different ways in which these can be done. So in summary, we've discussed how information technology affects airline planning and operations, and we've just touched on a small part of how information technology takes place. We've looked at the different airline distribution systems and how computer reservation systems evolved into global distribution systems and how these interface with the airline's res system and also with the revenue management systems. We've described the distribution costs and e-commerce developments, and especially we'll be showing as to the way in which airlines have managed to use e-commerce to get the cost of the ticketing down itself. We'll have taken a look at innovations in passenger processing, and then we'll have looked at airport ownership, the land side and the air side, how they're managed, how they set user charges, and how the income from these user charges is then distributed to ensure that the airport grows with the growth of air travel itself. And finally, we've looked at the way in which people can go about financing airports. Airports are now a big part of the business. Airports are now to the stage where they're earning equivalent funds to airlines, but making much, much larger profits. This is an important part of the course, and you'll find this part particularly interesting because of the recent trends that have been showing the future directions. Thank you.